Welcome to this edition of the ICT Newscast. I'm Mark Trahant. We have more in this presidential election campaign season that has brought unprecedented attention paid to Indian country. We'll have more on that and what it might mean for the future later in the show. But first, we're going to take a look at a historic moment from just a week ago when President Joe Biden formally apologized for the federal government's toxic boarding school policy.
The federal government has never formally apologized for what happened until today. I formally apologize as President of the United States of America for what we did. I formally apologize.
Biden took the stage at the Gila River Indian community to acknowledge, for the first time, the failure of a federal policy that separated families and promoted assimilation. Native children stripped of their language, their culture, and even a homeland. This era remains traumatic today, even as that same government takes initial steps towards healing.
Federal Indian boarding school policy, the pain it has caused, will always be a significant mark of shame, a blot on American history. For too long, this all happened with virtually no public attention.
The presidential apology came after the release of two reports from the Interior Department that spelled out an often hidden history of the federal boarding school era, one that stretched for more than a century. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland spoke about beginning the work when, as a member of the House of Representatives, she was asked to act.
Of course, I've lived this all of my life. Both of my grandparents were taken away to boarding school. My great-grandfather was taken away to boarding school. This is my history as much as it is many people's across the country. So I understood when they came to speak to me in my congressional office, I understood what that meant. And honestly, I felt like we needed to do something about it.
And she did. In Congress and then at Interior, which identified more than 400 Indian boarding schools and nearly 1,000 Indian children who died at these institutions. The first among many recommendations that Interior made was for a formal apology issued by the president.
It's a sin on our soul.
Reaction to the apology was mixed in Indian country. While the thoughts were welcome, there is a sense that there is serious healing that remains to be done.
The damage continues to happen because public schools still have, in many ways, those mindsets. In many ways, they still have that idea that native thought isn't worthy, or the child's heritage, language, culture, ceremonies, their concept of their spirituality is second.
And what's next? Secretary Haaland pointed to one priority she wants to see addressed.
One issue that we are all particularly going to work very hard on pushing forward is native language revitalization. That was the common issue across, Indian country isn't a monolith. We're all different across the country, but the one thing that we all agreed on is that their native languages were stolen from them. And so we are making a concerted effort to ensure that the funding is there in the best way tribes want to support native language revitalization.
Next, I'd like to bring in my colleague, Annette Pember, who's been writing about boarding schools for more than 2 decades. Welcome, Annette.
Oh, hi, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Let me just start by asking you the power of that moment where folks were bringing in so much memory from their ancestors as well as their own experiences into the apology from President Biden.
Yes, well, certainly across, it was a real spectrum, I think. Some folks I think were, what's taking you so long and, why don't you do something substantive? And then some people were just utterly, emotionally devastated, if you will, at the enormity of the apology and, what that meant, that this is really the first time the United States, particularly a president, has said anything specifically regarding boarding schools.
Well, on this side of the issue, I mean, you go back to Chester Arthur and he talked about porting schools in the opposite context and was really ready to use that as the mechanism for assimilation.
Yes, it was. It was definitely, there's no denying that this was federal policy. It wasn't just making Native people go to school. It was a concerted effort to obliterate, our language and our culture, and to subsume us into mainstream American culture, primarily as servants.
One thing that struck me being there, and I wanted to ask you about this, and it's something you'll probably not read in any media, is something like this with a message that carries with it 2 centuries of to be kind, terrible policy, much worse than that, of course. Yet the Native people who are there are the most gracious that I've ever seen at a public event for a politician. And I've seen that over and over when somebody could be the worst critic of Indian country. When they come, the graciousness of the people is just heartwarming.
I know. It's so touching. I think a lot of people didn't attend because maybe they felt they couldn't be so gracious, or maybe they felt they couldn't really stand yet another sort of performative, exploitation, if you will, of our emotion. I mean, there's talk about it. Let's split you in half. Let's have you, emote, and then you really don't hear anything again. So I think a lot of people did really feel very ambivalent about it, and that's why some people just chose not to come.
In terms of next steps, the real critical measure is what the United States does about it. An apology doesn't mean anything unless there's action. And one of the concrete steps that was mentioned is language renewal. And even though the budget doesn't reflect the kind of money needed to do that, it is a baby step. Maybe your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that Secretary Haaland brought up was that during her listening tour, that consistently that's something that people brought up was sadness over the loss of language, and that was really one of the things that was very instrumental in effectively in some cases erasing some elements of culture. So I think it's something people have a real hunger for because of that. However, one of the things I often reflect on is, the whole, Chester Alan Arthur, I think his idea was to, quote unquote, offer us education, offer the Native people education. And I think Native people really wanted it. Our people have never been, against education. I think, we are folks who are always looking for the next thing and always looking, to respond accordingly to our environment. So people were not averse to education. I think, but however, once they got there, they were super averse to having, our very soul crushed, if you will. So, some thought is, maybe how about delivering on that education you folks talked about, like a quality education, an education that would be in fitting with our desires and needs. So often, of course, we know that most Native people don't attend BIE schools. The majority attend mainstream schools. However, they're often substandard in the sense that, they're located in places that may not have the tax base, to hire quality teachers and so on. They may be located in areas where they can't draw from from some of the most talented teachers. Why not? Just supporting that very basic thing. I think a lot of people could really get behind that.
Think about in our lifetime how language has really started. It's still got a long way to go. But I think my kids' generation is much more akin to language than we were.
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, I recall my mother, when we would go visit her relatives and they would say some words in Ojibwe, Ojibwe, and it was always this kind of like it was as though you were saying, a profanity. It was like this sort of shame about it. And, we've gone from that level to celebrating it. And actually we're growing first language speakers, kids who are speaking it, is their first language. And that's phenomenal. That really is. And that we have people with PhDs in Ojibwe. I never could have imagined such a thing. and to feel actually proud, being speaking it and wanting to speak it and being even that being a possibility is remarkable, within our short lifespan so far.
Well, I just wanted to give you a chance to wrap up with your final thoughts on what we saw last week.
As I said, I thought I know for many people it was very emotional. I actually spoke to my my Ojibwa godmother, and she spoke of being very emotional. And her mother, she did not attend boarding school, but her mother did and her father did. And of course, they often spoke about it to her. And she really, I think, saw it as kind of foundational to some of the struggles that they had. So for her, it was really emotional. And a lot of people did say that. I had actually Freddie Lane from the Lummi Nation. He remarked, he said, "Wow, to have the commander in chief actually acknowledge and apologize for this is a big deal." And I think, people are really holding out hope that it is a first step, a meaningful first step.
We acknowledge and we hear you. Thank you, Annette Pember.
Well, thank you for having me.
And now we turn to the upcoming election. Youth are at the forefront this cycle, with organizations supporting their voices and efforts. Paris Wise has the story.
In the Southwest, youth-driven Native organizations are innovating ways to increase voter engagement for new voters and those who have been weary of the election process in the past. NAVA, known as the Native American Voter Alliance, works across New Mexico and has created a new coalition called Snag the Vote, a more fun and playful way to encourage voting.
We were sitting around all EDs of state-led civic engagement organizations, and we were worried about how we were going to get our communities out to vote in this election. We know that when we infuse humor in our messaging, that our communities respond. So we were sitting there like, what are we going to call it? What are we going to call it? And we were like, Snag the Vote. And we were like, yes, Snag the Vote. So that double entendre, that means that your call to action is to snag that vote. And if you take your snag with you, then that's even better.
A snag is slang in the Native community for someone you're romantically involved with, but with or without a snag, people are showing up.
In New Mexico, we've registered over 250 people in our state thus far with the Snag the Vote Coalition and our partners within the state. We know that we all fall along different political realms, whether we're on one side or the other. But the important thing is that we need to understand our power and our voices, and we utilize that power by making sure that we snag the vote.
In order to bring these people together, Native Guitars Tour is using music and entertainment to empower communities in partnership with Snag the Vote. This has been a way to make voting inviting and to encourage people to get involved, regardless of which candidate they support.
So our focus has been on the youth and making this really community-oriented in a way that steps away from what Hollywood sees natives as, right? Because we're fun people. We laugh, we eat, we sit together at tables and we make loud noises that people turn around and look at us. But that's who we are, that's community. Unfortunately, I feel like it's gotten to a point where our communities don't feel heard and they want to stay away from the system. Although, we have our cultural systems, we have our own governments within our tribes. Outside of that, we're still part of a bigger system. And until that changes, until we can change that, we need to make sure that we're involved and we're doing the things that we need to do. So our voice is heard and we're acknowledged as, Indigenous people.
Now, younger voters are using their voice to hold candidates accountable and gain recognition from them. When Natives Vote is a new organization created for youth by youth that landed their founder, Ian Teller, an opportunity to talk face-to-face with presidential candidate Kamala Harris.
I don't know, it gave like auntie vibes. That's the only best way I can describe it. Like she really had this sense that she wanted to get to know us, to get to know our stories, and hear what's important for Native youth. She asked questions because I mentioned that a lot of Native people still have this sentiment that the system isn't made for them, or it's something that they're not wanting to participate in because of, history and our treatment in this country. I think Native youth are a lot more aware of issues than people think. Just because of how we consume information, it's very different from older generations. We have access to social media, digital content. It's a lot easier to access information. Funny enough, also another issue that was really important that we've been hearing a lot, and something that we didn't expect to hear a lot from Native youth, was the state of the economy. A lot of people have really stressed, prices are a little bit higher, things are a little bit more expensive. The cost of living has just felt like it's a little bit robust or overwhelming. And so I think they feel it and they can sense it. And so that was something that was going to play a factor in their decisions.
This election cycle is bringing new levels of awareness to the Native vote, not only among communities, but to allies as well. Protect the Sacred is utilizing familiar faces to amplify efforts in getting people to the polls and engaging the youth.
We hosted our Walk to the Polls event with Mark Ruffalo, Wilmer Valderrama, and Kara Jade Myers. Ride to the Polls was created because of some of that hesitancy I've heard and the pushback that we heard in 2020 from young Native people asking me, why are you encouraging our people to continue participating in a system that was not designed for us and has never worked for us? And when I heard that, it really pumped the brakes for me. I had to take a step back because I agree with that. And so we've done our Skate to the Polls, which is a voter registration event. This year, we added a heavy metal concert to engage with those metalheads across the Navajo Nation and tribal communities in Arizona. And our Ride for Democracy, Bull Riding and Country concert to engage with the Indian cowboys and cowgirls out there. And so it was really exciting for the community, for someone from the Avengers, a superhero, the Hulk, to come out and take part and walk in solidarity with our community. Because part of that messaging is that we need help to move the needle, to make change. There's this buzz and this energy around this election this year that I didn't feel in 2020. And I really do think it's because in 2020, we realized our power and our influence. All of these movements across this country, around the world, should be Indigenous led, and let's continue leading these movements.
For ICT, I'm Paris Wise.
And now we're going to check in with our political correspondent, Pauly Denetclaw, on the eve of the election.
There has been such an emphasis on the Native vote this election. And we also see it in other states as well. Montana, for example, their Senator Tester put, over $1 million in Native organizations and other Native vote organizations in Montana to reach out to Native voters and get them registered. And so there are a number of campaigns that understand the impact of the Native vote and have been putting real money behind it.
6 years ago, I was in Montana covering that race, and Tester did a statewide bus tour where he went to every Indian community in the state of Montana just a few days before the election. In fact, it was Halloween because I remembered some of the people were dressed up in places he'd go to. So he has a long history of this. And if you look at the math, you almost need to round up every Native voter in order to even be competitive in Montana.
That's really true. And I was talking to Jordan James Harville from Advanced Native Political Leadership. And one of the things that he noted is that there are 50,000 new residents in Montana. There has been such an influx in the state from folks from out of state. And it's hard to calculate which way they're going to vote because in Montana, you don't register as a Republican or a Democrat. And so you just register to vote. And that makes it challenging to see where that's going to go. And I think that the Native vote is definitely going to be very influential this election, given that there are, those 50,000 new voters in the state of Montana, and just seeing which way it's going to go. And I also think it's interesting, given the comments made by Tim Sheehy, who is running against Tester. And so I'm really that's one of the races that I am really interested in watching to see how folks will vote in Montana.
It's interesting about the people moving in because next door in Idaho, as people move in, they're overwhelmingly Republican. They're people moving from California to get to a safer lifestyle. And it's actually self-selecting in terms of voters. So we're interested to see if Montana is like that as well. I want to ask you about the Republicans because Mark Wayne Mullen is their main surrogate, and he doesn't draw the same crowds as Vice President nominee Walz.
Yes. So Mark Wayne Mullen, Senator Mullen, he's the only Indigenous person who is on the Senate side, and he is out campaigning for former President Donald Trump, and he has gone to Arizona, Nevada, and North Carolina, trying to get Native voters. And this does seem like a very last minute sort of push by the Trump campaign, which hasn't put an emphasis on the Native vote in the same way that VP Harris has run her campaign. And so it really does, what keeps coming back to my mind is Representative Gallego now, but he is running for the Senate. He told me in an interview that a lot of candidates go to Indian country in the last 2 weeks of the election to ask for their vote. And so that statement keeps coming back to me, where it's like, now you see such an emphasis on the Native vote in the last push of the election, trying to get folks to come out. And I feel like that's what we've really seen over the last couple of weeks now, is this emphasis. But there are folks who have been reaching out to Native voters, and that has always been a part of their campaign.
It's interesting from history. One of the first surrogates to Indian country was Ed Nixon, who was the brother of Richard Nixon, a geologist by training. And Ed was sent to Window Rock in 1972 to try to campaign for Navajo votes. So it's an old story in terms of trying to send people to get others interested. One thing about this election that's so interesting, and maybe we can end with this, is how many people have already voted.
Exactly. There are so many people who have already voted via absentee ballot, via early voting. And that has definitely been such a shift this election, is folks are, voting in different ways compared to going out on election day and casting your ballot that way. And so there are a lot of people who have already voted. And it's very interesting to see how that is going to also impact this election. Voter engagement, getting people even voting is such a huge thing. And I'm so curious to see how, states like Nevada, who have really been doing the work to make voting as accessible as possible, and how all of these new voters are going to impact the election this year.
Well, Pauly Denetclaw, we'll look for your reporting and look forward to election night. We'll see you.
Thank you.
And finally, back to boarding schools. It's difficult to overemphasize the impact of the assimilation era that it was and is on Native families, communities, and nations. A central reason? It's hard to say when the era actually ended, as I learned recently when I visited the Morongo Indian Nation in California. 2 days before I visited Morongo, the tribe celebrated the anniversary of a major Supreme Court victory in Brackeen versus Holland.
As we honor the importance of ICWA and the U.S. Supreme Court decision, we should always also pause to honor the victims, the survivors, and the descendants of the boarding schools.
The case upheld the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, the law designed to respect family, culture, and tribal ties in child welfare cases. The ruling reaffirmed Native people's sovereignty of its most precious asset, our children.
The historic decision protected our children and protected our tribal sovereignty. It ensured that our children, that the tribe would always have a voice in their future. And it ensured that children could always be tied to their family, to their culture, to their heritage, and to the reservation community.
No one expected the decision to be as strong as it was. A huge victory for Indian country. And I think we have to take that victory and not take it for granted. So one thing, when we think about what's next, is to celebrate that win. I think in a way it's an act of resistance or an act of resilience to celebrate that win. And I hope that every June 15th, people across this country have an opportunity to remember that win, to remind everybody that tribes are not going to go away, that Indian children will continue to be protected. We know that the folks who want to bring down the Indian Child Welfare Act have their eyes on a much broader agenda, without question. I'm somewhat skeptical that they actually care that much about Indian children. I think they care much more about bringing down the concepts of tribal sovereignty to unleash the resources that tribes currently hold and protect.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.